So let me paint you a picture for a second. Imagine that you're leading an argument or a debate or something like that, and you're listening to the other side, and all that you can think to yourself is, huh? What are you even trying to say? Or maybe you're more like, that's what people think about me when I try to make my arguments. It's just not something I'm good at. And yes, I get it. Creating a cohesive argument can be difficult, and it takes a lot of practice. And while today we're not going to be looking so much at how to make strong arguments, we are going to deal with one of the most important questions you can ask yourself when defining that argument. Namely, what's the point of this paper? See, that's what thesis statements are all about. A thesis statement is arguably the most important sentence in your paper because it defines the point of that paper for your reader. It's the focal point by which your reader will read the rest of your arguments. But I'm getting into some of the content. So first, let's figure out what we're going to cover. So first, we're going to look at what is a thesis statement and what isn't it. Then we'll look at some examples of actually some poor thesis statements. Then we'll consider some strategies to build a better thesis statement. And then we'll close out. So first off, what is a thesis statement? Well, there are lots of definitions out there, but the one I'm going to use is this. It is a statement in which a writer affirms or defends the specific idea that will focus or organize a paper. A statement or statements, sometimes it's 2 or 3, in which a writer affirms or defends, meaning argues for or against, the specific idea, we'll talk about that in a moment, that will focus or organize a paper. So it's, again, that focal point. It's kind of narrowing into what the real topic is about. And you might be able to think of it a little bit like a shish kebab. In the same way that a shish kebab, or like the skewer of a shish kebab, holds together the meat and the veggies, a thesis statement holds together the entire paper. So the meat, the veggies, these are your arguments, your supporting points, your sections of the paper. But the thesis statement is the skewer that goes right through it all, that holds it all together, that keeps it together. In other words, it is the central unifying idea. It is the main overarching umbrella under which everything else in your paper hides. That's what your thesis statement is. It is that big idea that you want to communicate throughout the rest of your paper. Now, thesis statements can be a lot of things, but a strong thesis statement, I always like to say, will be said. Now stick with me here. I don't mean actually saying it out loud. It's an acronym. So first, it's going to be specific. By specific, I mean you actually have to narrow in to the detail you want to get at. So you can't just be like, dogs are the best, and call it a thesis statement. That's not specific enough. You have to narrow into, like, are you talking about certain kinds of dogs? Are you talking about being the best at what? The best pets? The best companions? The best, fetchers? Like, what are we talking about here? But you want to narrow into the specific aspect of your paper you're talking about. You don't want it being vague. Second, it needs to be arguable. In other words, you need to be able to actually take the opposite side of the argument. The best thesis statements I've heard are those where you could argue the exact opposite point and write an essay of its own. Because that means that there's an argument to be had. There's a debate. That's what we're looking for in strong thesis statements. The ability to actually talk about it and debate about it, not simply just spew facts. Third, it needs to be interesting. And the best way that you can write an interesting thesis statement is to write about a topic that you're interested in. Interest is infectious. If you're interested, if your thesis statement is engaging, it's going to make your reader want to read on. And finally, it needs to be defensible. In other words, the rest of your paper needs to be able to back it up. If you don't have other ideas that can defend what your thesis is, if it's a totally wild claim, it's not a good thesis statement. So, said, specific, narrowed into the point, arguable, that you can actually debate and not simply just state facts. It needs to be interesting. You want to engage your reader with a topic that's going to make them intrigued. And then it needs to be defensible. You need to be able to back it up with research, not just ideas you came up with off the top of your head. And thesis statements are going to be found in all kinds of papers. You can find them in research papers. This is, of course, the main kind of paper that you're going to probably write in university, where you take information, you plug it into your paper, and then you argue something. But that's the key. Research papers are not just about a catalog of research. They are about using the research to argue your point. And your point is that thesis statement. You want to have that clear thesis statement on the front end that makes your claim and then argues that claim. What is it you're going to prove about that thing? They're also found in the behavioral sciences, psychology, sociology, counseling. Though here it's going to be less about making claims that you have to prove and more about hypotheses that you need to test. So you're going to have this hypothesis, a test you're going to perform, a study you're going to do, and at the end you're going to see whether or not you were correct in that hypothesis. That's what you're going to be making your thesis statement around. Reflection papers will also have a thesis statement. Now, a reflection paper thesis statement will probably be more opinionated than, say, a research paper one, because you're now not dealing with arguments about outside things. You're talking about your own personal growth. But the reality is you should still have a thesis statement that captures what it is you've learned, how it is you've grown, what it is you've reflected on. That unifying idea that incorporates all the other ideas you're going to talk about. And even book reviews are going to have thesis statements. Now, these are not going to be just a summary of what the book was about. A book review thesis statement is going to essentially give your critique or your evaluation of that text. And you're going to do it on the front end so that your reader is prepared for what's to come, knowing what your argument is about that book or article that you've been reviewing. In other words, every single paper needs a thesis statement. There is never going to be a time where you do not have a thesis statement in a paper that you write for university. They should always have one because, again, it is about getting that clear, specific, arguable, interesting, defendable point right on the front end. So if that's where they're used, let's talk a little bit about what a thesis statement is not. And they are not a statement of fact. So a good example of this, the War of 1812 actually lasted 3 years, is not a thesis statement. Why? Because it is just a fact. This is a reality about the War of 1812. No one's going to debate you about this. There's no argument to be had there. It's just a fact, not a thesis statement. Similarly, a thesis statement shouldn't just be pure opinion. I think that berries are the best tasting fruit. Again, not a thesis statement. It's an opinion. You could argue it. I don't even know if I agree that berries are the best tasting fruit. But the problem is that is just pure opinion. You can't defend it with research. Not a thesis statement. And it can't be just clickbait. You won't believe what 3 conclusions I drew about this idea. That's, again, not a thesis statement. You're not getting specific enough. Your thesis statement still needs to make a claim about what it is you want to argue or prove or test throughout the course of your paper. So, that's what they are not. They also should not simply repeat the question. This is something that I find a lot of students, when they first start university, misunderstand. So they might say, in this paper, I will answer the question, what are the social ramifications of mixing friend groups? And the problem is that's not really a thesis statement. That is literally you just copying and pasting the question into your paper. But in the flip side, you shouldn't just reword the question either. This is even more common. In this paper, I will consider the social ramifications of mixing friend groups. Again, why is that a problem? Because you aren't being specific enough. You aren't actually telling me what those social ramifications are. You're just saying that you're going to tell me eventually. Don't do that. On the front end, give me a little bit more specifics. Tell me what it is those ramifications are, what that idea is, what the answer to that question is supposed to be. That's how you make a strong thesis statement. And not only that, but there are certain things that thesis statements don't have to be. We often tell students that they have to be 1 sentence long, and that's not true. They often will be. It is often the case that you will only write a 1-sentence thesis statement, and you probably shouldn't go longer than that if it doesn't need it. But sometimes, especially for longer papers, maybe in the master's level courses or doctoral level courses, you might need a little more than 1 sentence to explain what that key central unifying idea is. That's okay. Similarly, they don't have to fall at the end of your introduction. They usually will, particularly in things like research papers for the humanities, but that's not always even the case. Philosophy will put their thesis statement at the beginning of the introduction, not at the end. The behavioral sciences, it's often found throughout. So just recognize that it doesn't have to go at the end of an introduction. It's a good place to put it if you're not sure where else to put it, but it doesn't have to be there. So that's what a thesis statement is and isn't. Now, let's practice. what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to put a couple of thesis statements on the screen for you, and I'm going to ask you to take a look and decide what's wrong with this thesis statement. How is it not communicating as effectively as possible? So let's look at the first one. This paper will answer whether schools have good education programs. So take a moment, pause the video, figure out why is this a poor thesis statement, and then we'll keep going. So my issue with this thesis statement is that it simply rephrases the question. And perhaps this is cheating a little bit because I didn't give you the question. But if we go back, we can imagine what the question was. Do schools have good education programs? Again, this is just a rewording. You haven't actually given me the answer. You haven't told me yes or no. And you haven't even gone specific enough to say, okay, well, education programs, what is that? You haven't defined enough in your thesis statement. You haven't given me enough to work off of. So that's one thing you really want to be watching for, is that a good thesis statement, again, can't simply rephrase the question. Let's do another one. In Canada today, we face the problem of keeping our air clean. So take a moment, pause. Why is this a bad thesis statement? All right. So my issue with this one is that it isn't specific and it doesn't identify the problem. It says we face the problem of keeping our air clean. And I'm sitting here thinking, well, okay, what is that problem? Are you offering a solution? Are you just talking about the problem? What's going on here? It's too vague. You haven't been specific enough about what you are actually hoping to accomplish as you write this paper. Again, thesis statements need to be specific. They need to tell me exactly what you are hoping to accomplish, not in so much detail, because again, that's what the rest of the paper's for, but specific enough that I know what your main unifying claim is. So now it's your turn. This time what I'm going to do is going to put that poor thesis statement at the top of the screen, and then I want you to take a moment to come up with what you think could be a better thesis statement that is more specific, more arguable, more interesting, or more defensible. Something that better communicates the unifying idea that that paper could be about. So, in this paper, I will discuss the relationship between fairy tales and early childhood. So again, take a moment, pause the video, try and come up with a stronger thesis statement, and then I'll give you my example in a moment. All right, let's look at this one more closely. So there's two words that I find are really vague in this thesis statement that could be stronger, more specific. It's discuss and relationship. Because all you've done in this thesis statement is kind of said, I will look at this topic, instead of actually telling me what about this topic that you want to look at. And specifically what I would want to know is, what is that relationship? What is this thing between fairy tales and early childhood that we want to be looking at? So I'm going to give you my example. Yours will probably not be the same. And that's okay, because it would be the argument you're trying to make. But this is what I came up with. Not just empty stories for children. Fairy tales are a conduit through which readers can wrestle with childhood fears about life and growing up. The reason I think this makes for a strong thesis statement is you've got a couple of key points here. That first phrase, not just empty stories for children, sets up an opposition. It sets up the opposite perspective that somebody might have. They are just childhood stories. There's nothing fancy about them. So I've already set up a counter argument that we'll talk about that in a little bit, but a counter argument that shows why this is an arguable thesis. And then it provides you the specific relationship. Fairy tales are a conduit. They are a way of accelerating how readers can wrestle with childhood fears about two things: life and growing up. What's great about this thesis statement then is that not only does it provide a counter argument and provide an actual answer, but it sets you up for some of the points we're going to talk about. We'll probably have a paragraph or two or three about childhood fears about life, and a paragraph or two or three about childhood fears of growing up. You've set up very clearly as part of your thesis statement what this paper is going to accomplish. Again, it's that central unifying idea. It's that through line that shows how this paper holds together, and it provides you the actual map by which you're going to cover it. If you watched our video from last week about introductions, this is a great way to get through that idea of road mapping what your introduction is supposed to look like. And we'll look in a little bit about how that works together in a moment. Now, before we go any further, I want to address a question that I think some of you might be asking right now. You might be saying to yourself, Brent, that's great and all, but how do I go from this thesis statement to this thesis statement? Because that seems like a pretty big jump in quality. And it is. The reality is you're probably not going to go from rephrasing the question to Nobel Prize winning thesis statement overnight. It takes time and practice and work. But what we can do is we can look at some tools for building a better thesis statement. We can look at what are some of the things that you can do or you can say, what are some of the tips and strategies you can adopt that will ensure that your thesis statement captures the essence of your paper. Well, the first thing you want to look at is, does your thesis statement actually answer the question of your paper? Remember, this isn't just rephrasing the question. It's actually providing an answer, whether that's to the specific question that your professor has given you, or a question that you make up based on the topic or the ideas in the course that your professor has asked you to write about. But the idea is you need to give an answer, a specific answer to a specific question, rather than just saying, I will consider these ideas. And similarly, whatever that answer is, it needs to be supported by your paper's main sections or its main arguments. Those 2, 3, 4, 5 other big ideas that you're going to be looking at throughout your paper, you have to make sure that they can tie back to your thesis statement in clear ways. I like to think of it kind of like pillars. If your thesis statement is the roof of the building, the arguments of your paper, those different sections are going to be the pillars that hold that thesis statement up. So ensure that your thesis statement answers the question and is supported, is defended by those ideas that you bring up in your paper. Some other things you can do, ask why, how, and so what. These questions are massive for refining your thesis to become stronger and better. Why is the question of elaboration. It forces you to think beyond the surface level and go deeper into what are the reasons behind something. So if you're writing a paper about the American Civil War, if your thesis statement was the Civil War was fought about slavery, why? Why did the North fight for slavery? Why did the South fight for slavery? What was going on there? Ask yourself that why question. Dig in deeper to get to the ideas you really want to capture. How is a question of practicality. So if why is going deeper, how is thinking about what does that actually look like in practice? How do you make this thing happen? How does that claim look in real life? It is forcing you to think through implications and ramifications of the idea that you're expressing. And so what is the question of relevance? Why should I care about this in the first place? What does this contribute to the larger discussions about this topic? Who really cares? That's what you're trying to answer with so what. And all of your thesis statements should consider at least one, if not all three of these questions to some extent. Why is it important? How is this actually lived out practically? And why should I even care about it? So what? That asking yourself these questions is going to make your thesis statement stronger as you come up with answers. You're also going to want to avoid vague terms and sweeping generalizations because it makes it difficult for your reader to understand what you're talking about. For example, if you use a lot of words like people, society, best in your thesis statement, what does that mean? When you talk about society, are you talking about Canadian society? Western society, North American society? That's just three in this culture right here. And there's how many other different cultures that we could be talking about. So again, when you start using these vague terms, it becomes very difficult for your reader to know what you mean. So specify, go in specifically. And again, avoid sweeping generalizations. All people think this way. Really? All people? Have you asked every single one of them? It's a very dangerous ground to start walking when you make this big generalization about all things in a category because it's going to be very hard to back that up. And again, think about your measurements. If you're trying to call something best, you better be able to have a scale to back that up. How are you measuring how that thing is best? Is it objective? Is it subjective? What are you doing with that? Watch out for those kind of vague notions that can very quickly run away with you if you aren't careful. Another thing to do to make a strong thesis statement is to consider the counter-argument. We talked about that at the beginning. Not just empty stories for children, remember? A counter-argument shows your reader that you're considering the opposite opinion and shows that it's arguable, that there is something to debate here, which is again going to make your thesis statement stronger. Oftentimes, a thesis statement that considers the counter argument will start with something like whether, while, although, because it's showing that there are two sides of the equation. But again, it doesn't have to be in that thesis statement. You might just cover the counter argument throughout the course of your paper. That's okay too, but it is worth considering including in your thesis if you think it's going to make it stronger. Next, the use of because. I know some students who will swear up and down that because has to go in the paper. And you know what? Like, there's actually some value to that, to some extent at least. So what's great about because is it gives you kind of a formula. This is my claim because A, B, and C. To use my usual example, dogs are the best pets. Claim because 1, forces you to get exercise. 2, forces you to be sociable. And 3, forces you to have a long play session every day. I don't know. But the idea is that because forces you to have that claim on the front end that you're going to defend. And then those 3 statements afterwards, 2 statements, 4 statements, whatever, gives you the roadmap of your paper. So it's a really good way, if you are struggling with thesis statements, this is a great way to start. Claim, because, section 1, section 2, section 3, etc. Over time, however, you may find that using because is limiting, and that's totally okay too. You don't have to use because. It's a very useful starting tool, but as you get better at thesis statements, consider dropping the because and let the claim stand on its own. And don't be afraid of change. The reality is that your thesis statement that you start with when you first start writing the paper will probably be different from the thesis statement you end with. And this is even the case as you're researching. When you start researching, you'll often have a working thesis statement, the preliminary answer to your question. And as you do your research, the answer to your question changes and becomes more of a definitive idea that you want to argue. And maybe as you're writing, you realize, oh shoot, my ideas have changed again. That's totally fine. It's fine for your thesis statement to change as you write. Just make sure you go back afterwards and fix the thesis statement. The last thing you want is to have a thesis that doesn't capture the spirit of your paper. And lastly, remember that a thesis statement is part of your introduction. And this ties a lot back into what we talked about in that previous video. A thesis statement is trying to accomplish something in your paper, just like an introduction is. And that thesis statement is part of the introduction and part of that accomplishment. So remember that an introduction is trying to zoom in the map. It's trying to ease your reader into what we're talking about and narrow the focus of the topic at hand. Then we will often provide a roadmap. Sometimes this is part of the thesis. Sometimes it comes before. Sometimes it comes after. But the idea is you're providing those 2, 3, 4 sections that your paper is about, those supporting arguments for your thesis. But then the idea is that the thesis is X marks the spot. This is the place that you are trying to take your reader to throughout the paper. Again, it's that big overarching idea that you were trying to communicate. So after you have zoomed in the map and provided that roadmap, you're going to mark the spot on the map, X, this is where I want to go. That's your thesis. And then the paper itself is taking the reader on the journey. You guide them through that roadmap, guide them through the different arguments you want to communicate so that you can bring them at the end to that definitive claim that you were trying to argue in your thesis statement. Because that is the point of the paper. Everything you do after that introduction should be coming back to that thesis statement over and over and over again. Why? Because that thesis statement is the point you're trying to communicate, that idea you're trying to express, the thing you are trying to prove above all else in the paper. And if you're able to get that right on the front end, it is going to help your reader make sense of the arguments to follow, and it's going to prop up your main claim, making your paper that much stronger. Now, as we wrap up, I want to give you one more exercise for you to do on your own time. I don't have answers for this one, but I hope you'll play along. I've got 3 sample questions here. Some of them are silly. Some of them are a bit more serious. But what I'd like you to do is to pick even just one, or you can do all 3, and say to yourself, what would be a specific, arguable, interesting, and defensible thesis that I could write about these questions? Remember what we talked about to build a stronger one. Ask yourself why, how, so what. Avoid those vague and nebulous terms. Consider counter-arguments. And yeah, if you need to, use because. That's totally fine. But see if you can come up with thesis statements of your own that are going to effectively argue what you would want to say about these topics. But I'll leave that for you to do on your own time, because that is all I have to say for today about thesis statements. As always, if this is something you want to work on in more detail, if you want to go over thesis statements with someone or look at one of your previous papers or even for a paper you're going to be handing in soon, we'd be happy to go over that with you at Writing and Tutoring Services. Just book an appointment with us and we'll help you how we can. And we also have tip sheets, and one specifically about writing thesis statements that you might find useful. I'll put the link for that in the description below. Thanks for joining us today, and I wish you all the best as you finish up your assignments for the semester and keep on working to become a better writer. Take care.